he ain't coming back. Beneath the rising sun.
The history of new media. So the approach that I'm going to take today is to talk about the idea of optical accuracy versus optical illusion. So starting with optical accuracy, the farthest I'd like to go back to share with you are Roman paintings. And as you see here on the left, I mean, the Romans are working in fresco, which is a very difficult medium if you think about the difference of using a computer versus fresco. With fresco, you lay down wet plaster and you put the pigments into the plaster directly. So the ability to create this illusion of water inside a clear glass is really very advanced for the time period that we're talking about. And over here on the right, you see the use of architecture and the creation of an illusionistic space using the architecture. In tile work, it's even more difficult to create those illusions. And what you've got here is an example of a floor tile that has intentionally been what's the word I want? Embellished with what seems to be the leftovers from a party. And so it's actually the garbage after a party, and it's always on the floor. And what it's supposed to symbolize is that these people really know how to throw a party. When you move into the Renaissance then, artists are starting to use some, now they're moving from fresco and tile to tempera paint and eventually oil paint. And the trick with the medium of paint is that oil is going to give you the easiest illusion, the optical illusion. So Giotto on the left is just starting to figure out how to do accurate realism in painting. He's using overlapping. So the angels are kind of overlapped, and you might notice on the edges there are a couple of angels that their faces are kind of cut off by the halos. And at the time, this was really extraordinary, right? You just wouldn't do that in painting. And so he was seen as a pretty forward-thinking modern painter. He's also using the architecture of Mary's throne to create this sense of illusionistic space. But he's having a little trouble here in the front. So there's a step. It's supposed to be a step. It's supposed to look like a step. But it's actually flipping back and forth between seeming to project backwards as a step and seeming to project outwards. That's something called equivocal space. And in the Renaissance, equivocal space is a mistake. There will be artists and probably, do you have FedEx? Is FedEx here in Amsterdam? Yeah, okay. So the FedEx logo has an arrow in it, right? Between the E and the X. And it's an optical illusion. It's an example of equivocal space. Who's seen the arrow? Anybody seen the arrow? Awesome. Some people have not seen the arrow yet. So next time you see the FedEx, look for the arrow. And when you see the arrow, suddenly that will be the only thing that you see in that logo. And that's the optical illusion of that equivocal space. That background space of the white becomes the foreground space. So today, that's an awesome thing. In the Renaissance, not so much. Masaccio does a little bit better because he's using a barrel vault now. And he's actually using something called linear perspective. And he's creating a specific place that you need to stand in the church to see this as a true optical illusion. So it's also a mistake because if you're not standing in the right spot, you don't have that sense of three-dimensional space. He's using what we call a reverse perspective. So what the artists eventually realize, and you might recognize this is the Van Gogh Museum on the left, right? This is the slide that I always use to show my students what I mean by linear perspective and how linear perspective works in a work of art. The artists are realizing that in reality there are optical phenomena. And then they're able to capture that in works of art and kind of work backwards from reality into the illusion. So with linear perspective, you have the optical illusion of parallel lines that converge into what we call a vanishing point. And that vanishing point, you see it very clearly here with the trolley lines, right? They seem to converge on the horizon. So the horizon is this, it's an illusionistic line between the ground and the earth. And how this happens is really quite complicated, but it's a combination of the fact that our eyes are round and that the earth is round. And so over distance, this illusion is created. There's a second thing that happens here that's called atmospheric perspective. An atmospheric perspective has to do with the accumulation of dust and dirt particles over large expanses of space. And it creates the optical illusion again that in the distance, things are kind of blue and gray. So if you've seen paintings where mountains are blue-gray, they're trying to capture this idea of the atmospheric perspective. And it happens here as well. So the things that are closest to us seem in very, very sharp detail, and the things that are far away are fuzzy. And the things that are closest to us have more accurate color, and the things that are farther away are become this kind of uniform blue-grayish color. So here's how an artist then in the Renaissance translates these reality phenomena into artwork. So Leonardo da Vinci on the left is using the single point perspective. He needs to have the architecture of this interior space to create those lines. And in a second, I'll show you a diagram that maps out how those lines happen. In the Mona Lisa, he's using what he will call sfumato, but it's his term for atmospheric perspective. So he's literally trying to paint an envelope of air around the Mona Lisa's body to create this sense of volume or mass even for the air particles. So here's an example of, this is what art historians do when they don't have anything else to do. They draw diagrams on top of works of art. And it shows how when you extend the lines in the space, that the lines converge at a point. Now, this is a little misleading because it looks like someone's taken in America we'd say, taken a hit out on Jesus, but that's not actually the case. That vanishing point happens miles away behind his head on the horizon, but it's hard to see because the painting is in such a poor state. So I like to show this oil copy of The Last Supper to give you a better sense of what it really looked like originally. And this is another example of, an artist who's working in a medium that's very unstable. And I know, technology can sometimes be unstable, right? But what Leonardo da Vinci found when he did The Last Supper, he wanted to be experimental. And so he painted on the wall using tempera and oil paint, and he kind of forgot that he was in Milan, and it's very humid, and it started immediately flaking off the wall. So they're doing like the 4th or 5th major reconstruction on it right now. This copy lets us see how he had lines on the floor to help that linear perspective happen. It also lets us see out the window, and that's really important because for the linear perspective to work, you need to see the horizon line somewhere in the distance to get that sense of space. It also lets us see that he's using atmospheric perspective in that background. So notice that the mountains are blue, right? So these are the kinds of things that today, if you're working in a digital environment and you want to create this sense of realism, these rules are still applicable. Here's an even more difficult way of working. So this is inlaid wood panels. But the wood panels have been created in such a way to create this illusion of reality. And I've got several details here. So you've got objects inside the cabinets. You've got cabinet doors that are open. You've got books kind of falling out, and all of that is created by cutting the wood into little pieces to create this sense of accuracy and illusion. My favorite one is the one with the squirrel here. So you've got the full landscape scene, and you've got the piece of architecture in the foreground, and you've got the lines to create the linear perspective on the ground. So something happens when you're working with bodies in works of art in the medium of painting especially, but it also applies to the computer. We use something called foreshortening, and foreshortening is applying perspective to a body that's moving in space. And what artists like Mantegna found is that they actually had to cheat a little bit in order for the realism to work. So what I'm showing on the right is a photograph of a man lying in kind of the same position that Christ is supposed to be. So Mantegna wants us to see the wounds on the bottom of Christ's feet so we identify with him, right? And feel emotion. But if he showed the feet the way this happens, it would look a little bit like Christ has clown feet. I mean, the feet would be way too big. Even though it's accurate, it would be way too big. So he lifts the body up a little bit. He tilts the body up to create that foreshortening, but at an angle, so the feet can be smaller. And so he's not accused of blasphemy, right? So what causes the foreshortening is shading. I mean, it's the positioning of the body, and then it's shading on the edges of the body. So Mantegna was working in oil paint. This is fresco. This is Michelangelo. And so getting this kind of effect of the arm projecting into space in fresco is incredibly difficult. So we had some technology that comes into play when we're talking about creating perspective and the illusion of space. And one of the earliest examples of technology is this draftsman net. It's a way of creating a grid on an actual body. So artists would do what they call squared drawings and then transfer the drawings onto another medium and finish them. And this is a technology to try to put perspective onto an actual physical body. Now, in this next work, this is a contemporary Canadian artist who's playing with what Dürer was doing in his woodcut. And so what she wants to suggest, which is true if you think about it, if you think about it from the perspective of what the draftsman is seeing in the Dürer, what he's seeing is right up this woman's skirt, right? And when Danny Lariche decides to adapt this or do what we call an appropriation, and I've seen a lot of Blender work that uses appropriation. It's kind of borrowing or quoting from earlier art forms, right? An important thing that Danny Lariche is going to do is erase the nature on the right-hand side of the depiction here. So what she really wants to do is emphasize the phallic quality of that object that creates the sense of perspective, right? Yeah, I know, it's very funny. And I love the fact, too, that in this one, she has the screen on there to make sure that you see those squares, right? So, back now we're in the Baroque period, right? This is foreshortening by Caravaggio. And so, again, working in oil paint has a better ability to control that effect. And the reason for that is that oil paint takes a really long time to dry. Fresco dries really quickly, and if you make a mistake with fresco, you have to chip it off and start over. You can keep painting on top of oil for centuries, actually, if you want to. Most people aren't alive that long. In the Baroque period, we also have the development of another technology, and so this is the very beginning of the camera. So a camera obscura is essentially a pinhole device where light carries the image in on a pinhole and reproduces it upside down. And the original camera obscura, as I'm showing here, was a room-sized device, and the artist had to go inside and hang something called scrim, which is a really, really thin fabric, and then draw on top of the scrim. And they'd be drawing upside down. They'd be tracing the image upside down, and then, of course, they could flip it. Now, eventually, these things were table size, and then they became cameras. Why this isn't a camera yet, in the contemporary sense, is that it's not fixing the image. The artist actually had to do that themselves. Vermeer is one of the first artists to really start using the camera obscura. And what you have then in this case is this very accurate depiction of space, but without depending on the lines of the architecture, without depending on linear perspective to create that illusion. He literally can figure out the layers because he can trace them. Here's another example of Baroque work that's got the realism in it that's very important in this case for the concept. So what a vanitas still life is in Holland in the 17th century is a kind of warning. So Holland is very rich in this period, well, very rich generally speaking compared to other countries. And so in France and in Italy, you've got very wealthy people and very poor people. In Holland, because of the trade, because of the seaport, you've got a much greater, what we call now a middle class. You've got more people who can buy works of art. And at the same time that they're interested in buying works of art, they're Protestant primarily, and so they're not interested in having religious depictions per se. So this is a symbolic reminder that, and it is a kind of religious reminder that someday you're going to die. And the way that you see a vanitas, or how you know it's a vanitas, is it will have a skull in it, or it might have a timepiece in it, or it might have a burning candle to suggest this idea of time. And so this one's got the skull, but I really want you to see, you know, the illusion on the left, where you've got this spherical object now that's creating this optical illusion. I'm going to show you an Escher where he pulls that idea out and elaborates on it. But the purpose of the sphere here is to make sure that it's the person there that has to worry about, you know, what's going to happen when they die, and that they can't take their wealth with them. And the person there is important for creating that sense of, well, I don't want to say doom, but that's kind of what it is, the sense of doom. Now, that kind of optical illusion in the curved mirror develops into what's called trompe-l'œil. And trompe-l'œil is an illusion that is so realistic that it literally fools your eye. And so the translation of trompe-l'œil is trick your eye or fool your eye. And so on the right here, the Pito, it seems like it's a collage, right? There's a photograph there, and there are ticket stubs. All of that is painted. And there's a great story that goes along with the Peale on the left. Both of these are American artists, right, from the 19th century. Peale's wife was just sure that he was painting naked women. And she thought that this cloth that's actually painted, she thought it was a real cloth. And so the story is that she scratched it, trying to get that cloth off to prove that her husband was painting naked women. So we go from that trompe-l'œil is not very dependent on photography, but we move into a period where now photography, starting in 1839, you've got a daguerreotype, which isn't very good in terms of a photograph, but by the end of the 19th century, you've got pretty much the photographs that we would have today, except that the negative is what's called a glass negative. Instead of the little tiny plastic ones, right? Although no one's using that kind of camera anymore, but it's important for artists in this period. Daniel Bouverie is an example of an artist who not only did he use photographs to, the other artists would say, cheat, to make his work seem more real, he left those photographs. He didn't destroy them. And we've got photographs of him using photographs, which is really quite extraordinary. I would say that most artists of this period, the Impressionists, Manet, they all used photographs. With the exception of Degas, we don't have their photographs, and so it's difficult to prove that. What Daniel Bouverie's done is now composited. He's taken the two horses from the two photographs at the left and created this work on the right. This kind of work is called Naturalism, and so it's a salon equivalent or a very official academic art equivalent of Impressionism. And Daniel Bouverie was accused of cheating, because that's the way the technology was viewed at that time. But the technology of photography was really, really important for accuracy. So I'm showing the Géricault because before Muybridge did stop-action photographs, artists could not figure out how a horse moved. And so horses were always depicted running like rabbits, where their front legs and their back legs are together, right? And we know now that the legs split. But Géricault is an awesome painter, but this is a kind of ridiculous painting because he doesn't understand. Well, they couldn't slow down the horse enough to figure out how it was moving when it was running. So here's a Manet that demonstrates that he used photography. And I'll be honest, the family of Manet, the descendants of Manet, don't want the photographs to be found because Manet has become famous for being the first quote-unquote modern painter, which just means that his paintings were flat. And they were flat because he used photographs, and photographs compress the space. And it's very evident here because he composited 2 photographs where the figures aren't in the right scale proportion. So the little girl's way too big, right, in this picture. And as a result, you get this kind of strange, it's not just flatness, but it's a distortion that happens. And of course, this is what makes him famous. I think the descendants are afraid that if the photographs were found, that somehow Manet's secret would be out, but most of us that work in this period, it's very obvious to us that he used photography to get these effects. Photography also had a huge impression, no pun, right, on Impressionism. And I used this particular work by Monet because this was exhibited in a photographer's studio. So, I mean, the Impressionists weren't scared of talking about the fact that photography was important. But this kind of thing that happens, this blurring, that's related, it's not so much atmospheric perspective, but it's because the photographs had a really long exposure time. And as a result, you were always seeing this movement. And so again, the Impressionists adapt from what they feel is reality, because they're feeling that the photographs are real, and then creating those kinds of effects with what's called the broken brushstroke technique. Sorry, my things are bleeding a little bit here. The next step, really, in terms of thinking about reality is Cubism. And so what Picasso and Braque are doing are trying to pull apart layers of reality and then reassemble them, looking at the framework or structures that are underneath. In this case, a person, right? So this phase, it's called the high analytic phase. They really strip the color out and they focus on structure. Then they go into this is Picasso, the synthetic phase. And in the synthetic phase, they're using some areas of collage and then painting on top. And so I'm showing here, this pattern is actually an oilcloth that has been pasted onto the canvas, and then Picasso layers paint over it to try to create this sense of confusion about what's real and what's not real. And of course, at the same time, he's making some sexual jokes, and we don't need to go into that, but he's doing a lot with this painting, let's say that. In the decorative phase then, everything is painted, but now Picasso is painting to make it look like it's collage, to further that idea of confusion. If we jump ahead into what's called minimalism, they have a different definition of reality. So what the minimalists are thinking is that painting equals paint on canvas. So we should just show paint, and that's reality, admitting that it's paint. Nonetheless, Newman is interested in having the idea of space, even though he's embracing this flattened form. And so these stripes that you see, Newman created those using masking tape, and he paints over it, and he pulls the tape off, and he's got this perfect line. This is the big secret for minimalism. People always wonder, how did they get those lines? Tape, that's how they got those lines. You pull the tape off, and he called those stripes zips. And so he figured that the viewer could imagine that they could enter the painting through those zips. And then you've got Fontana, who comes a little bit later and says, well, let's just slice the canvas, right? Then you've got real space in minimalism. Newman was suggesting that you could get behind the canvas, and Fontana literally takes you behind. With certain types of conceptual art and postmodernism, and so I need to be careful here because postmodernism is huge, right? But Kossuth is a good example of dealing with this idea of illusion versus reality in the postmodern period. Postmodernism, if I speak generally, breaks down boundaries. And so the boundary between the viewer and the artwork, so artwork that asks you to interact. If you're making a computer piece where people have to manipulate it, that's postmodern because it's breaking down that barrier. But also barriers like past and present, barriers with genders, any kind of barrier you can think about. And so this is really the barrier between real reality and a language-based reality and a photographic reality. And so there's an extra trick here because I'm showing a slide of this, but if you were in a museum, you would see the actual chair, then you see the photograph of the chair, then you see a dictionary definition of the chair. And so Kossuth is kind of trying to interrogate those levels of reality and which reality is more real. We call this conceptual art because the value is in the idea rather than the materials. So you might say to yourself, couldn't anybody go and make their own Kossuth? And I would say, yeah. I mean, absolutely. You could totally recreate this. What makes it valuable in a museum sense is that he had the idea first. And so you can copy it, but it won't be worth as much as his original, I guess, even though his original is kind of a copy. My students now look at this work and just assume that this is a digital photograph, but this is actually a painting. But it's a painting that takes the use of photography to another level. So what Janet Fish does in her acrylic and oil paintings is project an image, just like I'm projecting on the screen. It's almost like going back to that idea of the camera obscura. The image is projected and then she traces. And then she paints in acrylic on top of the tracing, and then she uses some oil on the top to create the trompe-l'œil effect. And so again, we started out talking about this idea of reflections and reflecting light and transparency. And you go back to the Romans, right? They were doing that in a medium that's more difficult than what Janet Fish is doing. It doesn't make the illusion any less significant. With video, which is considered new media, so definition of new media is any medium that uses digital technology. And there's this funny thing that happens with the term new media. Some people are like, well, it's a stupid name, right? Because how long can anything be new? But the reason that it's called new media is because technology changes so fast. And so what's new in technology is really important. And that's why the word new media, I mean, I don't dislike that at all. Bill Viola did a whole series of these works where he's showing videos on plasma screen TVs. And so what he's doing is actually creating a digital video painting. And then the movement in these is extremely slow. It's almost painful to watch the expressions on the actors change. But what he's trying to do is to get us to think about technology and how technology has sped up our reaction time to such a degree that no one's got any patience anymore, right? If your web page doesn't load in 0.2 seconds, you're ready to call somebody, there's something wrong with your computer. So that's the kind of trajectory of that optical reality. But there's a different trajectory that you can do with the illusion. And so for this, I go all the way back to cave paintings, because what this was supposed to do is act kind of magically. I would say that the forms are abstracted, but the forms were supposed to actually create a condition for the primarily hunters during this period. So by painting these animals and painting themselves in the hunt of the animals, it was supposed to create an actual reality that they would be successful. But if we jump from cave paintings, back into the Renaissance, there are paintings that are on ceilings that are called, we call this quadratura. It's just a illusionistic ceiling painting, where you've got this sense of reality above your head that starts affecting how you feel in the space. And so with this one, it's like these little winged babies could urinate on you at any moment, right? Because you're seeing their little bottoms in that foreshortened perspective. You also get illusions, distortions that happen with convex mirrors. And so mirrors are a real fad in the Renaissance, but they love the idea that you can distort things with them. Arcimboldo has this sense of reality and non-reality at the same time because he uses very realistic-looking objects to create portraits that then seem unreal. And so these are from the four elements. So everything that's in the water portrait is, something that you would find in the ocean, right? And only birds make up the portrait in the air portrait. And then he does Adam and Eve. And so there's this illusion of all of these, actually it's all of mankind, right, in the faces of both of these figures. And the idea of the god of the harvest or a librarian that's made out of books. There's something that's simultaneously real and unreal. The Surrealists are going to be very interested in Arcimboldo because of his ability to do that. Some of my favorite paintings by Arcimboldo are meant to be turned upside down. And so, when you see it this way, it's a bowl of vegetables, and then suddenly it becomes a face when you turn it over. It's got a great one of a chef that turns into a pig, which is amazing. Here's another example of this quadratura. I mean, I haven't found anybody better than Pozzo, but I have to say you kind of need to go experience this yourself. Until I saw it myself, I could hardly believe it. But again, you've got this very detailed architecture. This is on a flat surface of a ceiling, and very detailed architecture in a sharp perspective to create the sense that this stuff is falling down on you. He also did an illusionistic dome. So again, it's a flat ceiling, but creating that sense of perspective. Anamorphic art plays with two different perspectives or spaces simultaneously. So on the left, in the foreground here, you might see a smear. It kind of looks like a smear. And then everything else seems to be in detail, and the space is convincing. You need to walk to a perspective here about like this when you're looking at the artwork, and then you'll see a skull. And so what this is a hidden vanitas portrait inside a double portrait. And that's playing with optical illusion. There's a different version of this, what's called anamorphic art, where the paintings are displayed on tables, and then you need a device. It's a reflective cylinder, essentially, and you look at the work in the cylinder. And so I've got here on the left an example so you can see the portrait. The two on the right are also portraits, but without the cylinder, they just look like this kind of mess of paint, right? The Futurists were very interested in creating the optical illusion of movement. And so they did this by repeating the form. So again, they're working in paint, but they want to try to transcribe everywhere the dog's tail is gone, and the legs, and the leash over a period of time. And I know the Futurist works don't look very political, but they actually are. They thought that speed and technology equaled the future. I mean, that's where the term futurism comes from, but they also were anarchists. And so they thought that they needed to destroy Italian society to start over. These are very dependent, too, on stop-motion photography. And so I've got an example here of the actual photograph and how it gets transcribed into the painting. Surrealism now, what surrealism means is realism beyond reality. So they're interested in dreams especially, but they also like wordplay and jokes, and they're reading a lot of Freud, right? So this painting says this is not a pipe, but there's a picture of a pipe, and so it creates this kind of play. The pipe is painted in a way where you can tell what it is, right? And so it plays with you. It plays with this level of reality versus non-reality. And you could say that what Magritte is saying is that it's not a pipe, it's a picture of a pipe. But what he's probably really saying is that in the dream space of Freud and in French slang, a pipe is a penis. And so it's not a pipe, it's a penis. More examples of Magritte doing the optical illusion, right? So it's very realistically painted, but these kind of improbable or impossible events. And of course, the work on the left, that's a painted depiction of sex in the Freudian sense. The train is supposed to be the penis, and the fireplace is the vagina, right? But he also plays with optical illusions like this one on the right, where he puts a painting up against a window and then continues the painting into the background. And so it's a painting of a painting, right, that creates two levels of optical illusion in it. Dali's going to go even further, right? And so on the left, in both of these, he's using linear perspective, but he's creating an optical illusion with the linear perspective. So the work on the right is simultaneously, an interior space and a portrait of Mae West. And on the right, he's literally dissolved his famous painting, Persistence of Memory, by using the linear perspective. And this starts to look, almost pixelated, right? The medium of film helps create not only reality, but in the case of the Surrealists especially, this idea of the optical illusion, right? Or unreality at the same time that you've got reality. And so in this famous scene, right, the woman's eye is going to get cut, but it's spliced with a cow's eye, and the eyeball kind of pops out. You've probably seen this movie. And there are several instances of using film to do that, to create these shocking juxtapositions. That's what the Surrealists were all about, was creating a sense of reality that's strange at the same time. Dali here is using what's called an exaggerated perspective. So he's using linear perspective, but he's putting us at an vantage point where we don't know what part of this picture we belong to. And it reminds me a lot, if you've seen Star Wars, the very first Star Wars, when the ships come over you for the first time, and they seem to come behind you even though you're looking at a flat screen. That's this translated into the video medium. So I said, remember that reflecting ball, right? So Escher comes back to this. Escher's considered, we call him like a second wave surrealist. He's not with the original surrealist, but he comes around to surrealism later. And of course, he's interested in these optical illusions, but creating them with a mathematical sense, right? So the stairs on the left, which of course are used in Labyrinth, seem to go on and on and on and never have resolution, because he's thinking about the mathematics of it. And of course, that's something that the computer can do automatically, is figure out the math. He's using perspective in both of these. He gives us the vanishing point on the left. And on the right, we don't have the vanishing point depicted, but we can figure it out based on where the lines are. And again, these are works that seem to work. You can tip them upside down. They seem to work from any angle, and that's part of the illusion. I was talking to some friends of mine, we were talking about Escher, and the idea that some of the artists I'm going to show you who are using Blender are redoing Escher in the computer medium. And we came to this conclusion that Escher would probably love this, because Escher was all about technology. So I like to imagine that if Escher lived to see, today in computers, that it wouldn't be the hands drawing each other, it'd be the hands using a computer mouse or using a keyboard to create those effects. In the 1960s, there's a type of optical illusion that is meant just to kind of, well, let's be honest, these artists were dropping acid. It was the 60s, and they're using these paintings. The paintings are very influenced by the idea of dropping acid, but the illusion in these, you can imagine if you dropped acid, is going to be even more intense. Bridget Riley's works are so effective that they can create migraines in viewers, and so a lot of museums have little tags up, if you're prone to migraines, please don't look at this work of art. But these are done with photographic emulsion. And it's the reason that she's able to create the illusion as strongly. Anuskowitz, he's using paint rather than emulsion. And so you don't have the same level of vibration in the work. So where does Blender come into the scene here? I mean, for me, Blender's an example of new media, right? Because it's working with digital technology. It's postmodern in lots of senses. So I'll show you some examples where there's appropriation is used. And appropriation isn't a bad word. There's appropriation that's effective because it has some kind of dialogue with the original. And then there's appropriation where somebody wasn't very creative and couldn't think of something better to do. Usually, I only talk about the appropriation that I think is having that dialogue with the past, or it's creating some kind of homage. And those are the examples that I'll show you. Breaking and blurring those boundaries. And so, again, things that are interactive. And then I think what Blender does is it's able to combine both of these threads, the optical accuracy and the optical illusion, into one. So let's look at some examples, right? So these are some 3D illustrations that I pulled off of Oscar Alvarado's website. And this is the digital linear perspective happening. And what I particularly like in looking at these two works is that he's avoiding the straight-on kind of linear perspective, but you've got the railroad tracks at the left showing how that vanishing point is happening, and then the work on the right, he's actually using what's called the worm's eye perspective. I mean, we're underneath the work. Here's another example, and this one uses appropriation. And I was really curious why Oscar used this anger painting in his three-dimensional illustration. So I emailed him, and he said, oh, well, do you really like the painting? I'm kind of intrigued by it because I'm an art historian. I know Anger's work really well. This is supposed to show Napoleon at his pompous best, right? This particular work, where he's completely outrageous and thinks he's going to take over the entire world. And what Oscar said was that he was really just more interested in having some kind of figure within that space. So it was, this is the thing with art historians. We will always read too much in to whatever you do. And I'll talk a little bit about how you can help us. If you write more about what you do, then art historians will be less likely to make up their own stuff, right? They won't always email you. And some art historians like to work on dead people. I mean, they work on dead artists because the dead artists aren't going to come back and say, well, excuse me, that wasn't what I was doing, right? So what I love about the piece on the left, I mean, obviously there's the sense of perspective there and there's the architecture there, but I think what's really brilliant is the ability to capture that reflection, right? So it's not just the reflection of the architecture, but it's the reflection of the painting that I think is really particularly effective and moving even. So here are a couple of stills from Murnau the Vampire, and that's to make this point that, it's not always about this three-dimensional optical illusion. And the reasons for using this kind of style, and I'd say when I look at the individual stills, what I really kind of see is an aquatint etching. I mean, that's the effect. So if you think about Goya's etchings, there's this kind of stippling that happens. And so the stills have got that quality, but working in black and white and working in a very abstracted or simplified form, and then creating these angles that are really, they're expressionistic. It stylistically works, even though it's modern. It works with the heritage that Oscar wants to talk about. So it's the German expressionist films. It's not just Nosferatu, although the title suggests Nosferatu. There's another vampire movie from the same period, Cabinet of Caligari, that has a lot of this black and white contrast that happens. This is Alex, and I'm not sure how to say his name, Glauian. Glauian? Oh my God, I was right. I love it. The other thing that I love about Blender is the ability to create this reality out of unreal forms. Because of the movement, and the space can be so specific. And so this little still reminds me a lot of Gustav Klimt, but of course it's in motion, and it creates that kind of sparkling, glowing, almost golden kind of effect, but as it's moving. I also was very fond of Glauian's what he calls aesthetic and realistic mood studies. And so I didn't email him. I emailed the next artist, but I didn't email him. And I probably should have. What this says to me, this idea of being aesthetic and realistic, it actually makes me think a lot of the artist Whistler. Whistler created these, you might know, like Whistler's mother, right? The mother thing is a subtitle in his work. So he called his works things like arrangements in black and gray. And that's what the mother painting is, an arrangement in black and gray. And what Whistler was really doing was color studies. He couldn't get away with it that early to not have a figure in the painting. And so you're not even supposed to see the person there. You're supposed to see, this harmony of the colors. And in this kind of study, and I say the color is a little distorted on the screen, it seems to me, but you get that sense of color independent of the fact that it's a landscape. So you can appreciate it as a landscape with the atmospheric perspective, right? So in the distance, the forms are getting blurrier, and the color is getting a little more subdued in the distance. So it captures that accuracy, but at the same time, you can look at it and just appreciate the combination of the colors, because it's really quite beautiful. Here's another example. His canyon pieces, right? So playing with reality and unreality. I mean, it's very clearly a canyon, but it's absolute perfection at the same time in the lines. It's almost impossibly perfect for rocks. And then he places us in a location, a vantage point, where, again, we're almost underneath this, and so we can appreciate the effect of it because of the vantage point he's chosen for the viewer. Here's the ocean study. And the atmospheric perspective here is very obvious. So there's a clear sense of a foreground and a background because of the use of atmospheric perspective on part of this, on part of the work. And I think it's a good example, again, of how, even though you're working in a computer realm, you can create these effects that are, very realistic. I mean, I think I could show this to my students, they'd probably think it was a photograph. And so it creates that sense of optical illusion. I personally, really love this idea of the stadium. It has, for me, a lot of suggestions of minimalism, and you can appreciate it just for the pattern of the colors, especially in the one in upper left, from that particular view. But then, of course, as you move into different locations, you get a better sense of what the objects actually are, which make me think of, Kossuth again, this play of reality and illusion that's happening in different dimensions. I pulled a couple of stills from The Evolution, and which reminds me of Escher's Blowball, but the little character here really has a sense of emotion as you work through that movie. And I'm not sure that Escher's work has got that, in part because there's no music and there's no movement added to that. And here are a few of the stills that I found particularly provocative in Evolution, to create that sense of space. And so there is the use of lines, especially on the upper and lower right hand here, to create that network of illusionistic space. You can also work, obviously creating very accurate textures. And so I chose this particular work as an example of, again, it's the real unreal. For me, this is, kind of a very updated Arcimboldo in a way, because it seems so realistic and textured at the same time that if I met this thing in reality, I think I'd be a little scared. And Escher was trying for textures too, but it's not, obviously it's not going to be as accurate. Some other examples of the real unreal, right? So creating a sense of in both of these, even though here, you've got the shadow in the background that helps, set the full three-dimensionality. But for me, it's more that I would be really convinced that this is a real thing. Surrealism, I think, is of interest. It's always been of interest. I mean, and it's a saleable thing. When I saw Elephant Dreams, I thought of Salvador Dali's work and the distortions and the illusions that are created with animals. I'm a big fan of this particular work by David Ravoy. And in a weird way, it reminds me of Leonardo da Vinci, because it's got the perfect geometry of that circle. But then you've got the distorted figures in the center of the circle, obviously not idealized human perfection, right, in the body of either of these figures. I mean, one's completely emaciated and then the other one is completely bloated. And of course, it's referencing yin yang, and so I brought the symbol to show that. I like the idea of the plate of food being the circle. But it's for me, it's, again, this kind of distortion and realism at one time. It's really quite beautiful. I also contacted Dolph Windvlet. Is that close, Tom? Windvlet? Okay. And he's done some writing on his website, and so I got a better sense. I mean, I wanted to ask him a couple of questions, but I got a better sense of what he was wanting to do. And he's very interested in surrealism, and he told me that he's at the Affordable Art Fair selling his work this weekend, so that's why he's not at Blender. But I was very intrigued with works that are clearly reviving Escher in the digital realm. And what I really like about it is that it would be easy to scan the Escher and create the illusion actually using the Escher, but there's the work that Dolph is doing is updating the Escher to make it seem more modern. And I really appreciate that. I think you really see it in the reptile version, where it's an homage to Escher, but it's not directly copying. And that's, I appreciate appropriation that happens that way, where it's absolutely clear that he's not trying to hide the fact that it's Escher, that he's celebrating what the computer can do to replicate these tessellations, that, Escher had to painstakingly draw the tessellations. So I particularly, what I really wanted to ask him was about the background in this image. And so this is the last one that I'm going to show you, and then I've got a handout for you, and we can talk a little bit about how you might write an artist statement, how you might help art historians and potential clients that come to your website and are curious about your work, right? This one I thought I particularly liked because you've got the linear perspective in the eyeglasses as a reflection, right? And then in the background, you've got all of these, and he told me they were cubes. They actually reminded me of an artist, Dora Salcedo, who likes to take chairs mainly and then stack them into spaces between buildings to fill up the space. And she's a very political artist, and so I sent an example of her work, and I said, have you ever seen this artist or whatever? And he said, no, and it's not political. However, she's doing what I'm doing. And so what he wanted to do was actually have this background space that is compressed at the same time that it's got that sense of illusion of space within it, and filling that space to flatten it at the same time that it creates the optical illusion of depth. So I don't know how I am on time. No one's come with a big hook yet. I've got some handouts. I'll be honest, I probably don't have enough for everyone. I think I brought 35, but I'm happy to give anyone who wants one who didn't get one my card, and I can email it to you. So what's on the handout, I do a lot of work with contemporary artists who struggle talking about their own work. And so the handout is designed to walk you through the process of first kind of doing an analysis, and then second, walking you through with a series of questions that would help you start to talk about your work. And so I don't want to imply that everybody needs to do this. I mean, this is if you're interested in doing this. I've noticed that some of the artists are very explicit on the websites, and some of them just have the images. And as an art historian who likes to publish about artists, it's helpful to me to have more information. And it can be helpful as a marketing tool to give more information if you're interested in doing that. So the first page of this sheet essentially gives you what I walk my students through when they're looking at any work of art. And so it's designed to work with any work of art. And I break it down into 3 components: the content, which is, we would call that the subject matter or anything that you see. And so if I'm using this work as an example, on the first level of content, I would say there's a man, he's got a beard, he's wearing glasses, he's wearing a cable sweater with a t-shirt underneath it, right? And then he's got a mass of forms behind him, and maybe I don't know what those are yet. And then you can go further and further into that content as you start interpreting that. And so sometimes content has a lot of layering to it. If we think about Oscar Alvaro's Murnau, right? Going way back to Murnau. That there's an illusion here, not an illusion, but an allusion to vampire movies, right, that were filmed in black and white. And so I would say, there's a primary content here that are the characters from the Murnau, and then underneath that, there's a reference to a different kind of content. And Oscar, alludes to that other content by giving us the name Murnau, right? So that would lead us to Nosferatu, and maybe even all the controversy about Nosferatu. Maybe you don't know that Bram Stoker's widow sued, and all copies of Nosferatu were supposed to be destroyed. And so it kind of went underground. And so there's a whole layer there about what happened to it. So that would be the content, and then we might talk about the style here. And so while Dolph's self-portrait I would call realistic, it's an accurate depiction of reality, I would call Murnau abstract. And so it's a simplification of forms. There's also something called, I would also call this expressionistic. There's not mutually exclusive terms, that it suggests some kind of emotion, right? And expressionism is very subjective. I mean, you might feel it, you might not, right? And then there are examples of works that are non-objective. And so like a painting by Kandinsky, or if you're looking at Glauion's aesthetic mood studies and you're not seeing them as landscapes, you might see them as a non-objective representation of lines and colors. And then there's the context. And the context, there's a context for this that comes from Nosferatu, but there's also the context of Oscar Alvarado as a person, as an artist. So his interest in vampires going way back, all of his animated work, the penumbra, right? All of that provides part of the context for this particular work. And Oscar is an example of an artist. Oh, gotta wrap it up? 5 minutes? Okay, we're good. He's an example of an artist who writes a fair amount on his website. So the second and third pages here are essentially a series of questions that you can choose to use. So you can identify your content, you can identify your context, and you can talk about your style. And what artists can use this for then is to write an artist statement that can help people who come to your website better understand your intention. It can also help you identify who your intended audience is, and that can help you in your marketing as well. So with that, I'll wrap it up, but I'm happy to answer any questions. If you didn't get a handout, please come get a business card, and I'll send you one. And I'm also happy to help you individually. If you are writing and you're struggling, I do that routinely, and I don't charge for that. So thank you.
I remind you, all the speaker material is online too. If you go to the Blender conference page, there's a link, and I'm uploading all the papers and texts and everything. I'm getting emails.
Now, the handout I didn't give you, but I can send that to you.
Send that to me. I will put it there too, so everybody can find it.
Thank you so much.
Now, 1 or 2 quick questions, and then we move to the next speaker.